Welcome back to Almost Pro, the podcast where we explore the stories, systems, and moments that shape sporting lives, even when the path doesn't go all the way to professional sport. I'm Laura.
And I'm Frances.
Today, we're talking about early specialisation in sport and whether it's actually helping young athletes or quietly harming them.
Yeah, we've recognized that early specialization is becoming more normal across way more sports than it has been before. We're sensing this pressure for athletes. We're sensing pressure for parents. We're seeing that the systems are really highlighting performance in children as the path. And we're wanting to ask the question today, is that early specialization helpful or harmful? Is it necessary or is it harming children?
Yeah, so I think the first thing we need to look at and define is what do we actually mean by early specialisation? And there's a few key identifying markers for this, isn't there?
Yeah. So it's, there's the definition that we can find with a little bit of research, the one that says it's about participating in one sport intensely year round or for at least 8 months of the year. So, lots of sports are seasonal, but that intense hyper focus on one sport with little or no participation in other sports and having an early focus on performance, on rankings, on being selected, as opposed to sampling loads of different sports, a variety of sports across different seasons, which used to be the norm, but is now, sort of being languaged as falling behind if you're not focused on just that one stream of sport that you intend to specialize in.
Yeah, it's interesting, this one, because it has become more prominent to specialize at a young age in across a variety of sports. It doesn't seem to be too focused on one sport and not the others. Why has early specialization become so common, do you think?
I think there's a number of reasons. I think we see more now. I think, and you and I have talked about this on a number of episodes, just this exposure in the current social media landscape. We're seeing inside the day to day, but that then builds its own brand. So we've got kids who have a social media brand, and in Australia, you can't have social media under 16 anymore. But parents are taking those accounts and they're setting them up for their children, and they're showing the talent that their children have, but in such a way that it's this pressure landscape to say that's who they are now. It's forming part of their identity. We've then got these pathways that are being, set up that I think many sports have longed for. How do we identify talent and then keep that talent growing in a talent pathway? But we're doing it early. We're picking them up really early and we're running them through pathways at ages that, we had Jay Lewis not so long ago talking about AFL in Australia. And
Yeah.
it was actually because he was so young that his pathway was actually not right in the end. It was the very thing that stopped him, for one of the things. But definitely if he were a bit older, I think he would agree he could have viewed what was in front of him a little differently, but identified early it was the best thing that could have ever happened to him until hindsight kicks in. I think the other thing is there's this commercial model now for academies. It's so many sports, right? So I don't know about you, but I'm on a number of sporting forums on social media. And I don't think there's a scroll that goes by without one of those forums having a new parent turning up saying, my 8-year-old is a brilliant footballer and we've just moved to the region and I desperately need to get him into an academy. He needs to start developing. And the pummeling they get in the comments for, like, I don't know, have you tried just community football? Like, let him have a run. Right. So I think it is a mixture of things, but the more we see it, the more we believe it's normal. And then we develop this feeling that our kid will miss out if it's not them too. So we might not even agree with the notion of early specialization, but if we're seeing it everywhere, we're seeing it in the landscape of our sporting environments, we're seeing it in the school setting, and then we're seeing it online in social media, as well as all of the marketing that exists around sport and prodigies, then suddenly as parents, I think there is a layer of going, uh-oh, if I'm not doing that, and my kid seems to have some talent, But do I have to knock on that talent's door today with my 11-year-old and make sure that that talent is being tapped into through pathways and academies and scholarships and all these selection funnels? Or can I just let them play and later work that out? And I think the question now is how much of it is about the athlete
Mm.
and what they need to be able to play their sport, and how much of it is it actually about the adult expectations and the systems that adults are developing for these kids. My 2 cents is it's not apples for apples. But there's a fair bit of research on this, Laura. Like, and we know you love your research. Talk us through what's out there now about understanding what's happening.
Absolutely. And first of all, I have to agree with you. After years of coaching, I wish I had a dollar for every time a parent brought a very young child to me and said they're going to specialize in this. And
Yeah,
it's a very, for the most part, well intentioned, but
yeah,
can be harmful in the long run. And that is what the research is saying internationally. Around the
yeah.
globe, there is consistency with this. There are strong links between early specialization and a variety of long term issues, including a major long term factor of not participating or wanting to participate in sport in
Mhm,
later years
mhm,
once they're past their time of playing. So
mhm,
amongst those factors, you've then got both the physical and the psychological elements. What the research is telling us is that there is a link between early specialization in sport and an increased risk of injury. And that can
mm,
also lead to long term injuries as well, because these children are training from such a young age in their developmental years that it is having real long term impacts on their body.
mm,
Then you're balancing that with the psychological elements that come with early specialization, such as burnout. Then we've got that, does my child want to participate in sport, period, ever
mm,
again? They've
mm,
focused so hard, they've been so isolated from their friendship circles, from exposure to other sports, um, from building themselves in a more broad fundamental perspective. Further research also suggests that children who are specializing early in one sport only narrows their skill set. So
mm,
this can apply to the sport that they're actually training for. So it can actually be
mm,
a detriment to their overall development in the sport that the parent or the child is wishing to excel at or become a professional or elite athlete in. So let's take football, for example. If you have
mhm,
a player that is training solely in football and they don't do any other sport, there's no other exposure, they're missing out on all these movement skills that are
yeah,
learned through other sports, through other activities. And even when we look at just play, general play as a
mhm,
child, there's so many skills there that can be learned. So having a broad sport experience is becoming something that is focused a lot in the development of professional and elite athletes now, which is
mm,
really great to see. Because what they're also finding through this research is that children who do have a multi sport base from a young age do
mm,
often stay in sport for longer. They have
yeah,
less injuries, they have better social skills and also sporting skills where they can easily adapt. And we see this from time to time, but I don't know that it's always at the forefront of our minds. So, that same footballer, we've heard of footballers in the past doing ballet classes,
yeah, yeah, yeah,
which
yeah,
might seem really strange, but we have these coaches and these experts in these field that are aware of this factor and they're going, okay,
mhm,
well, how can we better our players
mhm,
and how can we make sure that they are prepared for everything that this sport is going to throw at them?
yeah, yeah, yeah,
And
yeah,
it's across multiple sports. Tennis is a great example. Tennis is highly technical sport. So it's one of the major sports where people try and specialize early. But
right,
what we're finding is that children that mix tennis with, say, soccer for their footwork, spatial awareness, teamwork, all of these
mm,
other skills that come along with team sports, and also swimming for strength and core strength and breathing and all
mhm,
of the skills that come with swimming,
mhm,
actually perform better for longer periods of time.
Yeah.
So I
Yeah, yeah.
think moving away from this need to specialize early, I think we just need to sit back and think, okay, what is the important factors here? How early,
Mm,
how intense, and
mm.
how little rest are children experiencing if they do specialize early? And
Yeah,
what can we
yeah.
do to provide them a more holistic approach, which will result in greater performance for a longer period of time?
But it begs the question, right, that does early specialization even create an elite athlete? Not just is it necessary or harmful, but does it work? You know? And I think that's an important question to ask. What we see in the research is it's not necessarily a predictor of adult success at the elite level. It's also, as you say, well demonstrated that many elite sporting professionals have played multiple sports growing up. I think there's a statement that could be made that the early specialization might bring you to a place where you're winning junior titles, but you may not be hanging in there for a senior career.
That's it. I mean, there's definitely both sides of this, and there's definitely examples for both sides of this.
Yeah.
If we look at some of the world's top players across a variety of sports, we look at Serena and Venus Williams, who we know specialized, very famously specialized in tennis from such a young age. But
Yeah.
then we might compare that with someone to Michael Jordan,
Mm,
who didn't specialize in basketball. He had a very multi-sport approach. He played baseball, he played other sports, and
mm,
later came to specialize in basketball. So there is
mm.
athletes on both sides of this scale.
Oh,
Um,
agree, agree. And when, we think about Phil Stewart, who we've spent time with on this podcast,
yeah,
that for gymnasts, like Tony in figure skating, who will say to us, for that sport or those areas of sport, the dynamic movement spaces, they kind of need to go in early because they leave early. And we are seeing that change. We're seeing a better representation of demographic, of age span in those sports. But the reality is they're starting young because they're competing young on the full scale.
yeah. It's the those technical sports that you mentioned there. However, like we've acknowledged, there are arguments for both.
Mm, mm,
I don't think that you will actually see what the payout of that is until long after those athletes have stopped their professional careers or
yeah.
elite careers in those sports.
I also think culturally, it's so ingrained in some spaces, right? Like this is not you and I on a podcast solving this in 30 minutes. This
No.
is kind of just bringing awareness to a space that I think many people feel pressure to make a decision about.
Mm.
Whether it's, because their children are reaching an age where people are telling them that's kind of the do or die, you're either in or you're out. You're 10 now, you make your decision. Or they're watching it happen around them or they're looking at their kid and their kid's got a bit of talent and in the back of their mind they're going, could make something of this, not sure what that something is. So it's not this isn't about solving it. It's about recognizing that there is a growing cultural presence of early specialization. I think what is helpful is to look at examples where the research is perhaps a little older and consider, globally where early specialization is not necessarily encouraged versus where it is. You couldn't go past Norway as a cracking
Yeah.
example of, yeah, right, of a place that has said, we will do what we can to avoid early specialization. Not saying they don't, not saying you can't, but saying that culturally and by policy they work really hard to make sure that early specialization is understood in sports and for young athletes, and that it's discouraged where possible so that children are playing a broader range of sports or engaging with a broader range of sports. They don't do national championships for kids. They don't have official ranking for younger children. Their emphasis is really on participation. And I know in Australia there's this huge rally for participation, but
Mm.
oftentimes that surge or focus on participation comes from awareness of failing at participation. Whereas I think in the Scandinavian countries, Norway, Sweden, I think they're showing that they've got the research to demonstrate they're confident that early specialization isn't going to work for most people in most sports. And they have a lean towards late talent identification because they've seen, longer participation rates, as in staying in sport longer. They're seeing better athlete conditions. The athletes are well for longer, and they're getting better social outcomes, a broader social
Yeah.
outcome by keeping people in sport. So they're still producing elite athletes without this early specialization model. They're just challenging the idea that it's necessary to specialize early.
Yeah, absolutely. And now, time for a short break. Don't forget to like, follow, and subscribe to join the Almost Pro community and stay up to date with the latest episodes and news. To find out more or to apply to be a guest, visit almostpropodcast.com today. One of the things I love about Norway's approach is, as you mentioned, fun is the center driver for what they're pushing. It's
Right.
an athlete-centered approach. They want fun to be the main focus for young athletes coming through.
Mm,
Are they enjoying what they're doing?
mm,
And
mm.
then if they are, then there's steps in place to support them whichever way they go.
Yep.
And I think a lot of the times other models or other countries can often lose sight, and the entire focus becomes on the end goal rather
Yep.
than, is this still fun for the athlete, for the
Yep.
child?
Yeah, yeah, agree. Totally agree. I was it you telling me the participation statistics for Norway was in the order of 90% of children participate in organized sport?
Yeah, in recent years, a study was carried out about the early specialization on the global context, and
Mm,
Norway sat at approximately 93% of participation in sport, which is just astounding. And
mm,
those numbers carried from youth right through to late teens and beyond.
mm,
When compared to other countries, and the one that stood out for me the most was the US,
mm.
and the US sat at around 50%. And we all know how much of a big sporting nation the US is.
Yeah,
We spoke about the entertainment perspective last week, and how there's this big entertainment world around sport. And being an athlete here and an elite athlete here is, I think, a lot like being a superhero. We don't have real
yeah, yeah.
superheroes, we have our athletes. And when you look at those numbers, though, that really gives you pause. That really makes you think, okay, well, what are they doing to have this kind of sport participation rate compared
Mm,
to the US? And I think
mm,
it's
mm.
worth paying attention to with what they're doing and going, okay, is there something here that we can use in the US, and vice versa? Is there things in the US that we're doing that actually, no, let's keep that.
Mm.
But that, yeah, it's a big contrast, isn't it? 93 down to 50%.
Yeah, it is. It is. And, you can let the data speak for itself, but I think you can keep digging. And, Canada has a solid model. They've got their long-term athlete development model, and their emphasis is on physical literacy, on body movement, and that mobility that you talked about earlier, those foundational skills
Yeah,
that long term lead to injury prevention, right? Stopping the injuries that come from this physical burnout. They also have
yeah,
their long-term athlete development model also has a psychological development focus, which I think is important because these kids are often specializing in sport before their brains can receive the information they need to recognize what they're doing and where they are and what's happening for them. So that's sort of Canada, and Canada has a better official statistical position than the US. They're sitting somewhere in the sort of 75 to 80% of children within organized sport frameworks. The one that I find interesting, and maybe it's because it sits in my backyard, is Australia. And Australia has an official position of discouraging early specialization, but you could argue it's not applied consistently. And I think
that's
we can see
yeah.
that. Yeah, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think the complex thing about Australia is you've got so many different bodies of sport, across the
Mm,
varieties of sport that
mhm.
don't necessarily link. And so they're all operating with different frameworks. So while there might
Mm,
be an overall position within Australia, the governing bodies of each different sport have different methods or different opinions on
yep,
how to achieve athlete success.
yep,
And so there's not a lot of consistency there. And I think that that is something that hopefully in the coming years will be looked at to
mm,
say, okay, well, how can we as a country that loves our sport
yep,
produce a higher percentage of more well-rounded athletes?
yep, yep.
Not to take
There's
anything away from our current athletes who are fantastic.
No, agree, totally agree. But I think there's, we talked about this earlier about what is this growing need for specialization? What are we sensing? What are we feeling? What are we culturally receiving? I think in Australia, it is well and truly evidence that we followed some of those commercial academies, commercial coaching market models.
Mm.
Where we're building this outside of what has always been reasonably government led, and then institutionally led. For example, the governing body is controlling and then leading the programs that roll out in each of their sports. We are seeing an increasing commercial presence in the sporting space, which Australia hasn't actually grappled with like the United States has. Um, and I think even the UK, right, particularly in football, you're seeing very early talent ID and football academies. And we're kind of sharing that, as we make our way around the globe, as we become more globalized, as we share more information, as we see inside the lives of people that we'll never meet, we're seeing more and more of it and thinking how we can bring that into our own space. So maybe what we could take from all of that is to say the countries that have those high youth participation rates, like Norway, like Sweden, they are delaying selection, they are discouraging early specialization, and they do have a really, really strong emphasis on joy from movement, on variety, on inclusion in sport, and enjoying the space to play. And those countries that do have the lower participation rates do tend to have earlier selection, identified, narrower pathways at a much sooner age, and this tie of opportunity to performance, or opportunity equates to money from performing. So, it's no accident that Norway and Sweden are so often put up as the poster child or referenced in research. And it's not because anyone thinks the models are perfect, but what they are demonstrating is their participation rates are high while their elite success is not necessarily low. So they've been able to demonstrate that it's not a mutually exclusive relationship.
Absolutely, and their athletes are staying in sport for longer. So, on the other end of the spectrum, you have China, where children are encouraged to specialize in sport from a young age and often have their sport chosen for them. So, if there is a sport that they need representation in, then often children are encouraged to participate in that sport. And
Mm,
it even comes down to the different ways that sport is approached. And like I said, one end of the spectrum, Norway and Scandinavian countries of the like, the other end, China. In Norway, their philosophy basically have fun,
yeah.
multi-sport and just have fun. And there's a Chinese philosophy, and we're all going to have to excuse my Chinese here, but it's San Song Si Da, which basically translates to rigorous, difficult, and high intensity, I think. So
Yeah.
you can see even in the types of language that's used around sport, the two
Yeah.
different approaches to achieve success.
And the sporting landscape isn't for the faint of heart when you're hitting professional levels, right? Like,
No,
and you're
definitely
talking
not.
so when you're talking about young kids, like the requirements on them, the demands on them to start stepping into these spaces are huge. And just using broad examples, you could say things like we see players injured but it's a grand final and we're all sitting here praising the heroics, right? Oh, they played
Mm,
played on with an injury, couldn't have done it without them. Okay, but where is everyone now that they need rehab and that injury needs whatever it requires that
yeah.
stops people from doing anything else in their lives? So it's not a gentle environment if we're starting to talk about moving kids through it really early on, right?
Yeah.
Because the pressure to perform starts with the internals, sometimes from the individual, but sometimes from the family. And then it is piled on by the spectator. It is piled on by the team involved, because suddenly your good makes you very necessary. We need you to be performing. So I don't know. I think there's so many layers to this conversation. I think, I would say my view in summary would be, is early specialization necessary or harmful? Maybe it is necessary for some sports, and I think we've named those in a small handful, and there are definitely others. It may be necessary for some athletes, as you've pointed out, that in some parts of the world, that becomes more of a country's position than a family deciding that's what they want
Mm.
for child. And it may also be necessary for some pathways. It may be that in certain sports there are only pathways available up to a certain age, and after that you're on your own. And the reality is, we've talked at great lengths that, on your own is a very, very expensive way to tackle any elite sport. So I think it's still it depends, in response to whether it's necessary or harmful. I do think there's some pretty clear parameters around what makes it harmful, though. I think it's harmful when there's no longer joy in it. I think it's harmful when the child is not actually enjoying their participation. I think it's harmful when, as I referenced before, when we're normalizing pain, when we're saying to young children, without that, you've got to press on, push through, pain is part of the story. Well, actually, as someone my age now, I can tell you that maybe actually looking after some injuries when I was younger and listening to my parents who weren't asking me to specialize, but actually I was just stubborn. But listening prevents stuff that you're trying to manage in different decades of your life when you're not as young as you were, and your ligaments are telling stories about the silly things you decided to do when you were younger. Pain is not for normalizing. If that's happening, then it is harmful in early specialization. But I also think the big one is, if childhood is wrapped up in a performance contract, maybe early specialization is harmful. Maybe we're missing the fundamentals of a time in life you can never recreate. And I
That's
know it because I
right.
keep trying.
Yes.
I keep trying to steal elements of childhood. But once it's done, right? You can't unknow or unlearn all the things that you slowly accumulate that take away from being a child.
Yeah, absolutely. What I love about this topic is that we have recognized globally, regardless of which sporting country that you have come from, that there is a need for a change. And we're
Mm.
seeing a lot of different models of change happen. And so to me, I feel like we're in this real exploring phase, which is a lot
Yeah.
of fun.
Yeah.
Where are we going to end up with this? We've recognized that there's a better approach needed for developing athletes who are more well rounded, just people as well. And so it's great on a global context to be able to see all of this research coming out. And I love it. I can't wait to
Yeah.
see where we end up.
Yeah, yeah. I think it's summed up by saying the goal isn't producing elite 12-year-olds. It's about creating healthy and well-rounded adults who can still love sport and participate in a way that is healthy for them. So all of that said, you know, specialization is a tool. It's not a childhood. It's not the model. It's not the only model. We recognize there's places where it still has a very healthy home and is very necessary. But I think we're asking ourselves the question, let's do a bit of a checklist on whether this is helping or harming, and, start with joy, and measure pain, and do a quick check-in whether it's taking away from a childhood and turning it into a performance contract. Laura, I've loved this conversation. These moments where you and I get to reflect on research that we both pour ourselves into in different ways and at different times, and then roll it all up into a conversation to share with other people, I think are just really important for the sporting landscape in any part of the world. So I love having this conversation with you. I hope our listeners have enjoyed this conversation too. And if you have enjoyed listening to this conversation, please remember to follow along at Almost Pro Podcast. You'll find us on all streaming platforms. We've loved having you on our journey, and we can't wait to chat with you again next week.
Thanks, everyone.